Thank you, William. Well, we've got massive challenges in the Social Democratic Party. The gaining traction in the sort of political system we have is some people might say mission impossible, but our great strength is that we do have a coherent core of political ideas that appeal to a lot of people. Getting the message in front of them is kind of one of the many challenges, but William was the predominant author of the new declaration, and that really has been what's helped get the party going again and increase membership and draw people in, because it speaks to a set of ideas that there's definitely a huge demand for. Now, I'm going to speak very briefly, but just really on the social democratic case for Brexit. You know, I'm standing in front of you, 4 days away from something I've been striving for 10 years, and I'm very excited about. I would guess, being on a university campus, that the proportion of people who share my excitement in the room is not high in percentage terms, but there you go. Now, there are all sorts of cases for Brexit. There was the kind of ultra free market libertarian case, which probably the left would characterise as wanting to deregulate everything and start sending children up chimneys again for 100 hours a week. There's the ultra socialist case, which would be to regulate everything, nationalise everything, free rein on state aid, whatever. And there's a core of people on the left of the Labour Party, not as many as there used to be, and that was their motivation in campaigning alongside people like me for Brexit. Then there's a sort of more traditional conservative case based on loyalty to the Queen that might be pastiche as a bit Little England, red, white and blue, and the rest of it. And I think the social democratic case is distinct from all of them. There is certainly a conservative cultural element to it, that those ideas that bind the country together are incredibly useful. But we would probably see it more through the prism of social solidarity, that you must harness social solidarity where it actually exists, and not where you would like it to exist in some perfect world in your own head. And all the evidence is that and I think let me give you an analogy. Were you an intelligent Martian coming down to planet Earth and looking at the geography of Europe, Western Europe, you might work out that there'd be a very interesting relationship between the big island off to the northwest and the mainland, and then between the smaller island off to the northwest of the bigger island and the bigger island. And the point there is that geographic land borders definitely have a cultural impact. You can't drive, if you use the Channel Tunnel kind of freight line, you probably can, but you can't basically drive to have lunch, from the United Kingdom to Luxembourg or France. And like the European mainland has a higher degree of European identity. I think the social research shows that. But even in that case, it's not as high as a nation-state affinity. And William mentioned a couple of examples in his remarks, and I would go back to that in the case of German reunification, for instance, and most people in the room are too young to have a particular memory of that happening, but I do remember it. And there was for several years a lot of grumbling in West Germany about the costs of reunifying and of bringing Eastern Germany up to a similar living standard as the West. But it only got to grumbling because the basic nation-state affinity, the idea we're all Germans, gave broad, sort of, albeit grudging, support for the transfer payments, to use the economic term, that were required. But then you fast forward to the Eurozone, which only makes sense as a sort of fiscal union, and where stronger parts must subsidise weaker parts, and it just wasn't there. The Germans started talking about lazy Greeks. The Greeks had banners of Angela Merkel with a Hitler moustache, and far from harnessing solidarity, social solidarity, and bringing people together, you actually had a perverse outcome. Now I think Britain is on the sort of far end of this spectrum of European social solidarity affinity, and in your age group it's definitely grown. It's definitely more than in my generation, but it's still not nearly strong enough to bear the load of the proportion of collective decisions that were being taken by the European Union. And as Social Democrats, we believe in collective decisions and the power of collective decisions to improve everybody's life. And that requires compromise. We can't all get exactly what we want, and yet we must have losers' consent. So we have votes, we elect governments, they do things in the interests of the broad collective, which is the British people. And that requires a level of recognition of social solidarity that we have in this country. And you saw the classic, you might call it nationalist, I would say sort of moderate nation-state affinity, produce this miracle called the National Health Service, which is, one of the great institutions of British life. Does anyone really think that something called the World Health Service could have been proposed post-war and had the support of the British public? The idea that British taxpayers would set up a system and then it would be open on an equal basis to people from all over the world. I don't think that would have got off the ground, right? So there's nothing wrong in moderate nation-state affinity, and the fact is that is a much stronger driver in this country than a European identity, although there are certainly pockets of places where the European identity has actually grown up, albeit, funnily enough, in the shadow of the referendum defeat, which I think was a big shock. I now see in parts of London, you will see European flags hanging out of windows, and and in Cambridge, where I'm originally from, indeed, and that never used to happen. So there's definitely has been a bubbling up in certain pockets of this European consciousness. But it's nothing like generally spread in the country. So we certainly see that the further away you go from people's immediate vicinity, the weaker the draw of those decisions made at a collective level is, and the nation state being the upper level of effective democratic decision making is a core value for us, and I think that's certainly true. And what kind of really drew me into campaigning for Brexit from 10 years ago was the realisation that the European project, the ever closer union set out in the Treaty of Rome, it wasn't just a pipe dream, it really was going on, and you had a series of treaties which transferred more and more decision-making powers to the Brussels centre, whether it was Nice or Amsterdam, Maastricht before that. And in each case, the British political class dodged holding a referendum, and that was because they were fully aware of the weakness of the overall British public affinity. Now, had the British public affinity been very strong for the idea of moving gradually, step by step, towards a European superstate, then that wouldn't have rattled my cage so much. But it was obvious that people weren't being honest with the public, that they were dodging referendums. In the event, Tony Blair was desperate to get us into the European single currency, but he was manoeuvred into having to say, we will have a referendum first. And then polling really showed that there was never a day in which he could have won that referendum. So we didn't join the European single currency. And this peaked really at the Lisbon Treaty, which gave the European Union its own kind of constitutional identity, removed more national vetoes, and David Cameron from the Tories promised under all circumstances he would have a referendum on it, and then when it got ratified with that one, he reneged on that, and that's what really set the thing alight, and that I think Cameron then acknowledged that the public acceptance of the amount of sovereignty being transferred was wafer thin, and that wasn't the primary reason he held the referendum. The primary reason was the amount of pressure he was being put under by the likes of UKIP, but nonetheless he did articulate a bit of a case. And we saw in the referendum, despite the status quo and the establishment money being all on the side of yes, that this amazing result happened with the most people ever to vote for anything. To vote to leave. So we in the Social Democrats, for reasons of democracy, once that vote had been held, frankly it was quite outrageous and extreme that so many self-defining centrist or moderate politicians decided you could actually unplug it, rewind and pretend it didn't happen. And the basis of honouring that democratic decision became very important as well. But we believe that that the key to really harnessing social solidarity in this country and having a strong welfare state, properly funded law and order, schools, and the rest of it, the social contract, that can only happen through our nation state institutions, and that is why the main reason why I will be celebrating on Friday night, even if most of you aren't. So with that, let's hand over to questions. Thanks.